All right, well, welcome to El Paso Bible Church, our Sunday school hour. Those of you who are joining us via live stream or who will be joining us in the future, because I think that's what ends up happening most of the time. People don't, I'll just give you the benefit of the doubt. People who are watching, they don't want to come to Sunday school in their pajamas, but so they don't. They just watch it later when they're not in their pajamas, so that's okay. But here we are in Exodus. We're in Exodus around chapter 12, and that's kind of the way narrative is. We don't stop at a comma necessarily, but we're going to talk about this. Remember, we've been talking about the various plagues that have come upon Egypt for two reasons, and one is that Pharaoh is a dummy. Pharaoh is a dummy, and we've talked about that. This particular Pharaoh. There were many pharaohs prior and after this guy that were wise leaders who did smart things, but this guy was being used for this purpose, apparently, to provide for Israel to be brought out of Egypt and into their own land. And for that, to be used for that instrument, it was easier if he was a dummy, quite honestly. I mean, he just makes poor decisions. And he has completely hardened his own heart, and then we read that God hardens his heart in order to demonstrate his personality, his character, his faithfulness, his love, to demonstrate the place that Israel, the sons of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, play in his role. And he actually says that. I'm going to show you with this last one how I distinguish between Egypt and Israel. I'm going to show you that. And we could point to even more modern historical events that would distinguish Israel from the countries around her. Very recently, I was reminded again, I forget what I was watching, but it was one of those things where it showed all the Arab states around, all the Muslim states around Israel, and the little red dot. It was all in green, and there's a little red dot that was Israel, right? It's like, you can't even see it. A little in the formatting that he had. It was a huge Muslim world around them that's seeking to destroy them. And others have said that, but that doesn't happen in the world with Jews in particular if God does not have a protective intent for a people. It's not like Monaco, right? Monaco looks similar, right? It's a little country in the middle of a whole bunch of bigger countries. But it's not Jewish, right? So anyway, here we are in Exodus chapter 12, and you remember that on this last one, it's distinct, it's unique. All of the other plagues were specifically directed towards a deity or some sort of deity, some sort of religious practice that the Egyptians had adopted. So we had, the blood, the flies, the locusts, the frogs, the cattle. Am I missing something? Then the hailstorm that took down their agriculture. Did I miss one? Well, you get the idea. They're worshiping creation, or at least what they understand to be worshiping a higher being that is represented in their creation. This is a common pagan practice, but this one is intended to create a permanent memorial. So, in other words, the Jews, when they got into the land of Canaan and they were to overtake it, were not supposed to memorialize everything, right? They weren't supposed to go gather up all the frogs in Canaan and burn them just for grins and just to stick it to the Egyptians, right? That's not a memorial thing that they were supposed to establish forever and ever and ever. But this one is establishing part of their calendar when they would go out and be a nation in the land. And that's why, this is New Year's Day for them. Verse 2 of chapter 12 says that, verse 1. Now Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, this month shall be the beginning of months for you. It is to be the first month of the year to you. He says, speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month, they are each one to take a lamb for themselves according to their father's household, a lamb for each household. So there's an obligation when they're experiencing they have an obligation now, right? There was no obligation before, right? For Israel, we just read that Goshen wasn't affected. There was nothing in Goshen. There was nothing there. But all of Egypt suffered. They had frogs in their bread bowls. They all had boils. They all had it was the boils I forgot. Ooh, yuck. Yeah, well, so every once in a while, because I'm a beekeeper, I get stung like inside my nose and inside my ears. you know? Every once in a while, it happens. Stinking bees. I get real gratified that they die when they do that. But can you imagine having a boil inside your ear, inside your nose? Because you know that it wasn't just on someplace convenient, like the back of their calf muscle or something. That was the one. But there was no obligation for them. In this one, there is. And this is relevant to their future as a nation. It was a proclamation, right, that the Lord has purchased life, let's say. He has borne the cost himself. Your lamb shall be unblemished, male, a year old. Now remember that this is a picture of something. If you've raised livestock, you know that in standard practice in almost all civilizations is that a male animal that is designed to eat is not unblemished by definition, right? Unblemished primarily would mean intact. If you're ever in 4-H, you know, or FFA, or even if you're just like me and are a redneck with a big backyard, you know that. Because that's what you do with domesticated animals. That's why people bother rather than just going out and shooting feral pigs or whatever down south, because it makes better meat, generally speaking. But this is a picture of something, and that is that in the future, right? So we understand that people could not approach the tabernacle. We're jumping in the future here, right? People could not come into the tabernacle who were eunuchs. You remember that? They couldn't serve as priests if they were eunuchs. One of the promises of the future coming literal 1,000-year reign in the kingdom is that eunuchs would be restored and be able to enter into the worship of Yahweh again. But they were prohibited under the law from doing that. He's saying that the sacrificial lamb needs to be priest qualified. Certainly couldn't serve as a priest. You couldn't even enter the sanctuary as a eunuch. So that's the picture. He's unblemished. He's not supposed to be bruised up. He's not supposed to be missing teeth. He's not supposed to be some beat up ram. He's supposed to be a year old, unblemished, and intact. So we have glimmers of this. He says, you can take it from the sheep or from the goats, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. And then the congregation is to kill it all at the same time, all at twilight. And they will take some of the blood and put it on the doorposts and on the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. The sign is there. That's the obligation that they have. And we talked about this last time. And that is that temporally speaking, right? Because this is a temporal requirement. God is not directly casting anyone into hell here, right? He's taking their physical life. And that is that the fathers in these households, we would say the patriarch. We talk about being patriarchalists in my family, and we're not joking. We take the rule of the father in the home seriously. And we brook no argument with that. The reason for that, my brothers and I do not. Some of their wives did, but that's another story. We don't brook any argument with that. The reason is because it's a life and death situation. If the father of these households failed to slaughter the lamb as they were supposed to and failed to put it on the doorposts and the lintels, their son died. Their son died. Now, whether he went to heaven or hell or whether he went to paradise in Abraham's bosom, wherever, he died. So we don't we don't allow any argumentation on that. In my family and in the families that are operating correctly, frankly, we don't allow that. This is particularly the father's obedience that spares the son's life from the consequences of his sin, primarily. Their obedience is important. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled at all with water, which means it wasn't going to be tender, essentially. You're supposed to suffer a little while you eat it. Roast it with fire. Eat it with unleavened bread, blah. Eat it with bitter herbs. What they use today is horseradish root and greens, at least in the demonstration seders. You shall not leave any of it until morning, but whatever is left of it until morning you shall burn with fire. Essentially, you're going to sacrifice the remainder of it. You shall eat it with your loins girded. This is not Thanksgiving, right? What do you do at Thanksgiving? You put on your stretchy pants. You take your shoes off with the second plate, right? That's classic. That's sitcom classic. I don't do that. He's saying this itself is not like that. This is not supposed to be a feast. It's supposed to be a preparation. This is supposed to be nourishment that you're going to take with you on your journey. You have your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste and expectation, right? It's the Lord's Passover. For I will go through the land of Egypt on that night, will strike down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, man and beast. And against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. What was the primary sign of blessing? See, in a modern context, we're rather stupid. Even people that many others consider very mature believers look at a couple that doesn't have any children, and they say, wow, that must be a great life. I look at it, and no offense, but I say, that kind of sucks. And the ancient world considered that you were bereft of blessing in your life from whatever deity it was that you were serving if you didn't have a firstborn, or if your firstborn was struck ill and died. This is a theme that we see in Ruth, right? That Mahlon and Chilion die, and the father dies, and they die out in Moab. And Naomi says, man, I have been cursed. I have been absolutely cursed. I've come in full, but I've gone away, or I went out full and I've come back empty. My life is meaningless. But Yahweh says the reason I'm doing this is ultimately to execute judgment against all the gods of Egypt. How was that understood in the ancient world? And that was that if the people that served a particular deity were prospering, then the god was winning. The god was conquering. And so Yahweh's going to put that business to rest. I'm going to execute judgment against all of those. Nobody's going to have any mistake as to who is in charge of what's going on here after this one. The blood shall be a sign for you on the house where you live, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. Earlier it said, not even a dog will bark. No harm will come to you. Verse 14, this will be a memorial to you. You shall celebrate it as a feast to Yahweh. Throughout your generations, you are to celebrate it as a permanent ordinance. Remembrance was a huge part of remaining faithful to God, remaining faithful to Yahweh, particularly among the people of Israel. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats anything leavened from the first day until the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day you shall have a holy assembly, and another holy assembly on the seventh day. No work at all shall be done on them. I may be dysfunctional, but that sounds terrible. Not working for 7 days? Don't you have enough to do that it sounds terrible to not work for 7 days? Maybe I am nuts. The worst 3 days of my life that I can remember was when I had COVID back in November, and I literally couldn't stand up for 3 days because I felt like I was getting nothing done. It wasn't that I had a hard time breathing or that my blood oxygen was dropping or that I had a cough that I didn't want to cough, but because I felt lazy. I didn't like that 3 days. 7 days, you're not supposed to work except that you can eat. You can do what is necessary to eat. You shall also observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this very day I brought your hosts out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as a permanent ordinance. I remarked to you that I was in, Priscilla and I were visiting my uncle in Colorado Springs a couple of weeks back over July 4th weekend. Guess how many American flags we saw in Colorado Springs on July 4th? 1. Isn't that ridiculous? Isn't it sad? Tons of people. They all wanted the day off in a place where pot was legal, but no flags. No flag being flown. What happens in a country when you forget its birthday? What happens in a country when you forget its founding principles and its birthday? You lose it. It no longer maintains its identity. It's crashing and burning. He said, don't forget your birthday, Israel. Make it a big party. This is a feast for you. It's a unique feast. But it is a feast. You're supposed to remember the day that I brought you out of Egypt. On the first month, on the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. 7 days there shall be no leaven found in your houses, for whoever eats what is leavened, that person shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he is an alien or a native of the land. Can we say alien anymore? By the way, there is a motive behind erasing the word alien from speech. And that is that the law of this land gives the government power to regulate a very technical category of people called the illegal alien. It does not give the government power necessarily, in plain speech, to deport a migrant or to regulate a migrant's entry into the country. The correct technical legal term is illegal alien. Under God's economy in the land of Israel, there were massive quantities of laws that are explicitly stated to be applicable to the alien as well as a native of the land. Now, who was a native of the land that they're going into? The land of Canaan. The land of Canaan. The Canaanites, right? No matter who it is, when they're in the land that God gave them, this law was required to be kept. Doesn't matter who it is. You shall not eat anything leavened. In all your dwellings you shall eat unleavened bread. See, y'all think that matzah is unleavened bread, and it kind of is, but it tastes awfully good, right? It tastes like a high-quality cracker. Try making matzah with sourdough, or like without the sourdough leavening or whatever. I mean, it's unleavened, but try grinding it between two stones, right? That's actually the only wear that we find archaeologically on people's teeth from this era. It's not from dental caries. It's not from cavities, because they didn't eat enough stuff that turned to acid in their mouth. You know what it is? They were eating rock flour, and it wore their teeth down. So imagine taking all the fluffiness out of the bread from the leaven, which by the way, 10 to 12 hours for a decent sourdough starter to really leaven a loaf of bread the way you want it. That's why you can't do it in haste. But then taking the fluffiness out of the bread, you're concentrating the little rock bits and the little flat pita-looking thing, and that's what you're supposed to eat. But for 7 days, that's what you get to eat. It wasn't tasty. You shall not eat anything leavened. In all your dwellings you shall eat unleavened bread. Then Moses called for the elders of Israel and said to them, "Go and take for yourselves lambs according to your families and slay the Passover lamb. You shall take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood which is in the basin, and apply some of the blood that is in the basin to the lintel and to the 2 doorposts. And none of you shall go outside the door of his house until morning." Because death was outside the house. Reminds me of a news story I just read this morning down in San Antonio. An ex-boyfriend was vandalizing someone's car across the street. She lived with her dad. And so because they're vandalizing the car and people are dumb, and they know this is a violent person, he exited the door with his daughter and confronted the man in an armed fashion and ended up shooting and killing him. You think he's going to be happy that he did that? I don't think so. Keep your butt in the house. It's just a car. They come into your house, bring the rain. They come into your house, but across the street messing with your car, it's way, way cheaper to buy a new car than it is to go pay for what that guy's going to pay for. This is way worse. There's no doubt about that. The angel of death is coming into the land, and you have to stay inside the doors that are painted with the blood of the lamb that was slaughtered in order to purchase preservation, life. Don't go outside your door. Speaking to the elders, there may be stupid people among the children of Israel, but they're not supposed to be the elders, right? We don't have any stupid elders, but I've worked with some. People, it was ridiculous. Don't give a title to a fool. That applies in a lot of ways, though, right? Not just within the local church. Don't give authority or a checkbook or keys to a fool as best as you can avoid it. These guys they're taking on a big responsibility. Stay in the house all night long. You're not going to hear a dog barking. It's going to be absolutely quiet, but guess what you are going to hear? The entire land of Egypt is going to be crying out. Now, you may not think you could hear people crying out over the death of their firstborn from Egypt to Goshen. I guarantee you that they could. It was going to be a still, still night. The Lord will pass through, verse 23, chapter 12. The Lord will pass through to smite the Egyptians. When he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, Yahweh will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to come into your house to smite you. And you shall observe this event as an ordinance for you and your children forever. When you enter the land which Yahweh has given you, or will give you as he has promised, you shall observe this rite. And when your children say to you, "What does this rite mean to you?" By the way, this is memorialized in the traditional Seder. In fact, the youngest child gets asked by the oldest elder at the table, "Why is this night different than all other nights?" They still do it if they're observant. What does this rite mean to you? You shall say, "It is a Passover sacrifice to Yahweh, who passed over the houses of the sons of Israel in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians, but spared our homes." And the people bowed low and worshiped. It's interesting. Immediately, they believe Yahweh, right? This time. What were all of those plagues for? It was to prove to both Egypt and Israel who Yahweh says he is who he says he is. That's to prove it to them. The whole time they've been complaining about the process, haven't they? Why did you do this? Moses, we hate your guts. Since you showed up, we're being destroyed. We have extra work. We have this problem. We have that problem. We wish you'd go away. Pharaoh says the same thing. Moses is persona non grata, right? in front of everybody before this point. Then the sons of Israel went and did so, just as Yahweh had commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. Remember that spot. That's like, when someone says, Josh, you were right. I say, here, say that into the microphone. This is like the only time, right, where they went and did as God told them to do. Say that louder for the people in the back, right? Now it came about at midnight that Yahweh struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of cattle. Pharaoh arose in the night, and he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt. For there was no home where there was not someone dead. While the people of God worshiped in their homes in Goshen with blood over their posts and the lintels on their doors, the world around them essentially cried out. The ruling empire of the world in that day. Just want to mention, as the government and the media and everybody else is trying to get you all whipped back up into a frenzy. Are you whipped into a frenzy? I don't like to be whipped, period. Much less into a frenzy. That this is a common refrain in Scripture. That the world around us cries out while we worship. Josh, you would close your church if you had lost somebody close to you because of COVID, I get told. I have lost people close to me because of COVID, and no thank you. There was a time in my very young adulthood that I came to realize something that most people take a lot longer to realize, or they just stick their head in the sand. We are all dying. We are all dying. Y'all realize that, right? Casket makers make caskets this big. Some people die young. Some people die in their 20s, their teens, their 30s, their 40s, their 50s, their 60s. And it isn't always quick. I buried a friend of mine at 38 years old with more autoimmune disorders than you could shake a stick at. He died choking on his own vomit in his own bed. Terrible? Yes. So at what point do we stop worshiping the Lord just because the world is crying out? My friend would have said never. There's a great cry in Egypt, for there was no home where there was not someone dead. Then he called for Moses and Aaron at night and said, "Rise up, get out from among my people, both you and the sons of Israel, and go worship Yahweh as you have said. Take both your flocks and your herds as you have said, and go, and bless me also." Is there a blessing for the Tsar? Of course, my son, there's a blessing for everyone. May the Lord bless and keep the Tsar far away from us. Right? Fiddler on the Roof. You guys are going to have to watch that if you haven't by now. They're going to bless Pharaoh. Remember, he had told them, you can go, but leave your animals behind. Leave your flocks and your herds. Not that we're going to pillage them while you're gone, but something might happen to them, Ours all got killed. Yours will be okay. Take them all, go, leave quickly, and remember to bless me. The Egyptians urged the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, "We will all be dead." A little bit of an extrapolation, I think, but you have to understand their mindset, right? You notice this in Scripture. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, right? The blessings that the son receives as the firstborn, the child of promise, are imputed backwards to the father, right? And to the grandfather in that case, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We see that David, right? The blessings that Jesus brought about are imputed back to the father of David as a fulfillment of promise to the covenant made to him. And when you go through an entire nation and you strike down the firstborn, they say something like this: we might as well all be dead, because there is no one that is going to receive blessing and abundance and prominence in the future. There'll be no hope. So the people took their dough before it was leavened. By the way, this was tricky. We talked about this when we talked about Jesus turning the water into wine in the Gospel of John, and how people tell you that it wasn't really wine, and I told you that's bogus. The reason it's bogus is because you can squish grapes and leave them on your counter, and any counter in the whole world, and it'll turn into wine in 3 days, 4 days. You don't have to add yeast, you don't have to add sugar. There's already sugar in it, the yeast is in the air. The same thing with sourdough. If you want to make sourdough starter, you don't have to buy the fancy kind that Micah and I buy. I bought a 900-year-old sourdough starter the other day, supposedly. It goes back that far, they keep it alive. I don't know, that's like keeping a pet for 900 years. It sounds awful. You got to feed it every day and make sure it gets plenty of air and all that. But you can make it. You can just put a little flour and a little water on your counter, uncovered, add a little flour and a little water. In about 7 days, you have essentially a very thick beer. You have a paste, a flour that smells like alcohol. So you have to mix the dough and cook the dough, or it will become leavened, and then you're cut off from Israel. You've got to actually follow through with the thing and finish it. They took their dough before it was leavened with their kneading bowls bound up in the clothes on their shoulders. Now the sons of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, for they had requested from the Egyptians articles of silver, articles of gold, and clothing, and Yahweh had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have their request. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. Little foretaste, I think, of going into the promised land, right? Vineyards they didn't plant, houses they didn't build, a land flowing with milk and honey, both agricultural and natural abundance. The sons of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Sukkot, about 600,000 men on foot, aside from children. A mixed multitude also went up with them, along with flocks and herds, a very large number of livestock. They baked the dough which they had brought out of Egypt into cakes of unleavened bread, for it had not become leavened since they were driven out of Egypt and could not delay. Nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves. It becomes poignant later on here. They didn't. Right now, if you go, Cabela's used to sell a pallet of food in buckets. It's prepper food. It's horrible, awful. Here's a little secret for you. You shouldn't prep with food you can't stand. Really, it's awful. You're going to die of nastiness before you die of starvation, because some of that stuff looks like it already got ate. As my hillbilly relatives would say. You can't find that stuff now, because rather than develop skills, people had money and they went and bought stuff that they'll never eat. Same thing, for a year you couldn't buy whole wheat berries. How many of y'all have the equipment sitting in your kitchen to deal with whole wheat berries? Did we talk about the grit? Well, we do. That's how I found out that perhaps millions of people were buying 50-pound sacks of wheat berries that are just going to rot in their garage because they're trying to provide for themselves. But in this case, there was no time for that kind of forethought. They didn't bring any provisions. They could have brought them. They brought just a daily level of bread with them. but they could not delay. When the Lord said it was time, and they went. There's an interesting parallel here, right? I'll admit to liking a few of those post-apocalyptic, like science fiction shows, right? And you'll have a guy show up and he's got a truckload of gold and silver. And he shows up and he can't buy a loaf of bread. So I can't eat it. It's got no value to me. What does it say about Israel that they're going out from Egypt loaded down with elements of gold and silver and no provisions? Anybody? Okay, but understand, so you can live for 3 weeks without food. You can live for 3 days without water. You can live for, 3 minutes without air? The threes and the 30s. What does it say about somebody who's going out on a journey from the only home they've ever known for 4 centuries? They go out with no provisions in silver and gold. How long do they think they're going to be in the desert? A few days. A few days. And if you look at the route, it's only a few days. We'll get there. It's an expression of faithfulness. They believe that God is going to take them into the land that He has promised to them. He's given them indications of how He can provide for them, how He can preserve them, how He can protect them, specifically from Egypt. They're leaving the only home all of them have ever known with no provisions. Because silver and gold really only has value if you have an economy, right? Without an economy, the only thing that matters is what you're going to eat next, and clean water. Now, the time that the sons of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. And at the end of 430 years, to the very day, I like that. To the very day, all of those things that we look at as complications and delays and problems, that was the appointed day. The end of 430 years, to the very day, all the hosts of Yahweh went out from the land of Egypt. All the hosts, including all the people, all the animals, all the stuff, all the silver, all the gold, all the bread bowls, all of that. It's the big, huge thing, all of it. It all belongs to Him. The possessive here of Yahweh. They're His special possession. And they went out from the land of Egypt. Out from under the thumb of an idiotic, genocidal maniac who wanted nothing more than to keep them. Pretty poignant. Let's see where we are here. We got more than 3 minutes worth of material in this chapter, so we're going to stop. I always stop for questions after we're out of minutes. So I got 2 or 3 minutes. Anybody have any questions or comments, observations, criticisms, disagreements, accusations, snide remarks?
Why do you think the Middle East doesn't, the saying about those who don't remember the past will then repeat it? Is that what we're seeing, that they don't remember the plagues?
Largely. Well, so there's a dynamic in the modern nation of Israel, right, where the most conservative, are we not remembering the past in Israel? Yes. There are some people who remember the past who don't do a good job of it, right? So the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox, so there's the Hasidic and then the Haredi, ultra-Orthodox. There's a lot of interest in ultra-Orthodox now. Even though they live in the land, the modern nation of Israel, they say that it's illegitimate because it is not a return in faith, that they actually refer to their own biological people as Zionists as they spit the word out. And they would identify that. They would say, you guys don't remember what keeps us in the land. In the Middle East in general? Yeah, so here's what I think is happening in the Middle East in general. They're demon worshipers, for the most part. So we shouldn't be surprised that Islam tries to destroy Israel, because it is a counterfeit monotheistic religion, and the biggest lie in the world is that it is co-equal with all forms of monotheism. So we can see throughout history that Satan himself has attempted to short-circuit the Messiah, right? He has, since Genesis, has tried to eliminate the possibility of the seed of the woman crushing his head, right, all the way back. So the fact that the people that are immediately around Israel and camped around Israel is no surprise to us. What should surprise us is that Israel still sits there and stands. So, yeah, but I think, generally speaking, I think the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox perspective has some merit to it.
What about the Messianic Jews?
What about them? Oh, well, that they remember better? Yeah. Well, they're Christians. I mean, we don't call them Messianic Jews if they don't believe in the Messiah. So I think that to a large extent calling them a fulfilled Jew is not a wrong thing. And they were, yeah, so that was the idea. I mean, that's what Jesus came for. He came to the Jews. He was a Jew, and Paul even went to the Jews first, and that's what they were commanded to do. So I think that's a great dynamic. Yeah, Bill. Right. It certainly helped, since 1948, it certainly helped answer criticisms about the authenticity of Scripture. One, just the number of texts that we have been able to acquire. I mean, there were monasteries in the Middle East just chunking original language manuscripts and burning them when we found them. They were just getting rid of thousands of them because they were mildewy or whatever, and they didn't want the smell in their cloth. They didn't value what it was. But it certainly has done that. And I will say this, there's some valid questions about what role the modern nation of Israel plays in prophecy, but ultimately, at the end of the day, all dispensationalists have to agree that because of the concentration of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob descendants, that at the very least, the Lord is using the modern nation of Israel to preserve Jewish people currently, and has a plan for that. And so there is a good reason to be allied with the nation of Israel currently, just for our own preservation, right? We don't want to put ourselves in the position of the idiot Pharaoh at this time. Yeah, Priscilla.
The firstborn children who died, was it strictly the firstborn or was it firstborn son?
Normally, that reference refers to firstborn sons, what we would call the son and heir. Yeah, unfortunately, it's just how it is. The female children weren't accorded that. They couldn't inherit in most ancient cultures. So, normally speaking. And notice it actually even applied to the slaves, who weren't going to inherit anything either. Anyway. Alrighty. Any other? I always get everybody at the snide remark. Everybody comes up with their cogent comment when I say snide remark, like Glenn did here. Don't worry about it. I catch the elders sometimes with that too. All right. Well, if we don't have any more input or questions, we'll go. All right. Father, thank you.